Welcome back to the DRM News Podcast. We are diving into some pretty heavy stuff today.
Yeah.
The potential shutdown of USAID.
Yeah.
You've sent over a ton of sources on
I
this.
have.
And
That's a lot.
it seems like things are changing like by the minute.
Yeah.
So let's try to cut through the noise and figure out what is actually going on.
It's definitely a story that's grabbed everyone's attention, and for good reason. This isn't just about politics. We're talking about a potential seismic shift in U.S. foreign policy.
Right. And you've highlighted how this whole thing is intertwined with Elon Musk's new role in the Trump administration.
Right.
He's heading up this new department,
Yeah.
USAID,
Yeah.
Department of Government Efficiency,
Uh-huh.
with a pretty aggressive mandate to cut costs. But then Musk drops this bombshell
Mm-hmm.
that Trump's agreed to shut down USAID entirely.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And, you know, this is a huge agency. You flagged that USAID has a $72 billion budget,
Yeah.
which is larger than the GDP of many countries. Shutting it down could create a massive ripple effect across the globe, impacting everything from healthcare initiatives to clean water projects in developing nations.
Wow, that really puts the scale of this into perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get into the weeds,
Okay.
let's make sure everyone was on the same page.
Yeah.
For those who might not be totally familiar, what exactly is USA?
So USAID stands for the United States Agency for International Development. It's been around since 1961. And it's essentially the agency responsible for providing humanitarian aid and development assistance all over the world. Your sources show them working on everything from providing women's health services in conflict zones to ensuring access to clean water, HIV/AIDS treatment, energy security, and even fighting corruption.
So, like, what are some concrete examples of what USAID actually does on the ground?
Sure, yeah. You flagged an article about USAID's work in Ethiopia, where they've been instrumental in providing food aid during times of famine. They also played a key role in helping to control the Ebola outbreak in West Africa a few years back. And their work on promoting democracy and good governance in places like Afghanistan has been ongoing for decades.
So it's not just handing out food and water. They're involved in some pretty complex long-term projects, too.
Absolutely. And we're not talking about a small operation here.
Right.
You pointed out that in 2023, USA had over 10,000 employees.
Right.
This potential shutdown, if it actually goes through, is a huge EC deal.
Okay, so to understand how we got to this point, let's back up and look at the timeline.
Okay.
You've laid it all out in your sources.
Yeah.
It seems like things really kicked off with Trump's global freeze on foreign aid, which was part of his America First policy, right?
Yes, that was one of his first moves. And it definitely sent shockwaves through the foreign policy community. Then came these rumors about bringing USAID under the State Department, like maybe absorbing it into their existing structure.
But that's when things seem to have taken a more dramatic turn.
Yeah.
You've included reports of clashes between Musk's DOGE team and USAID security officials, who weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat.
Right.
Apparently, they refused to hand over classified documents and even restricted access to certain parts of the building. What was that about?
It's hard to say for sure, but some speculate that this was Musk trying to assert his authority and demonstrate that he means business. Remember, DOGE's mandate is all about efficiency and cutting costs. And USAID, with its sprawling global operations and billions of dollars in funding, might have looked like a prime target.
It definitely seems like that was a turning point.
Yeah.
Shortly after, over 100 senior USAID staff were suddenly put on leave.
Wow.
Then things really escalated. The USAID website went dark. And Musk made that dramatic announcement on X that Trump had agreed to shut the whole thing down.
Right.
And since then, we've seen the headquarters closed, employees told to stay home, logos and photos removed from their building, even their social media accounts going dark.
It does paint a rather stark picture, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's like watching a slow-motion implosion. So what's the thinking behind all of this? What's Musk's rationale for wanting to shut down USAID in the first place?
Well, your sources include several of his statements where he calls USAID beyond repair and a ball of worms. He's claiming that the agency is inefficient, potentially mismanaged, and not delivering the bang for the buck that taxpayers deserve.
But those are some pretty serious accusations. Is there any evidence to back them up?
That's where things get a little murky. You sent over reports from watchdog groups that have raised concerns about USAID's oversight and accountability in the past. There have been instances of fraud and mismanagement, like that scandal a few years back involving contractors in Afghanistan. but these have generally been isolated incidents, and USAID has implemented reforms to address those issues.
So it's not like the whole agency is riddled with corruption or anything.
No, not at all. And many experts argue that USAID, for all its flaws, is still one of the most effective development agencies in the world. You've highlighted articles from leading economists and foreign policy analysts who point to USAID's track record in reducing poverty, improving health outcomes, and promoting democracy.
It seems like there's a lot of disagreement about whether shutting down USAID would actually save money or make the government more efficient.
That's right. You've got sources that make compelling arguments on both sides. Some argue that eliminating USAID would streamline the bureaucracy and free up funds for other priorities. Others contend that it would be penny-wise and pound-foolish, ultimately costing the U.S. more in the long run by undermining its global influence and creating instability in regions where USAID has been a stabilizing force.
And it's not just about the money, right? You've highlighted concerns about the impact this could have on America's standing in the world. You've shared some articles about soft power. What exactly does that mean?
It's a really important concept to understand in this context. Essentially, soft power is the ability to influence others through persuasion and attraction, rather than coercion or force. It's about building relationships, fostering goodwill, and promoting your values and ideas in a way that makes other countries want to cooperate with you.
So, like, instead of sending in the military, you're sending in doctors and engineers.
Exactly. USAID has been a key instrument of U.S. soft power for decades, using development assistance to build partnerships, promote stability, and advance U.S. interests around the world.
And you're saying that shutting it down could damage America's reputation and make it harder to achieve its foreign policy goals?
That's the concern many experts are raising. You've highlighted op-eds and analyses from former diplomats and military leaders who argue that USI has been instrumental in preventing conflict, countering terrorism, and promoting democracy in strategic regions. They say that dismantling it would send a signal that the U.S. is retreating from its global leadership role and turning its back on the world's most vulnerable people.
Okay, so we've got Musk and presumably Trump arguing that USAID is inefficient and needs to go. We've got a bunch of other experts pushing back, saying it actually does a lot of good and that shutting it down would be a huge mistake. What about Trump supporters? What are they saying about all of this?
You've included some opinion pieces from conservative commentators who support the shutdown. Their argument basically boils down to the idea that the U.S. is spending too much money on foreign aid and that those resources would be better spent at home. They see USAID as part of a bloated bureaucracy that's out of touch with the needs of everyday Americans.
So it's kind of charity begins at home kind of thing.
Exactly. They argue that the U.S. needs to focus on its own problems first, like fixing the economy and strengthening its borders, before trying to solve the world's problems.
What about the argument that helping other countries actually makes the U.S. safer and more prosperous in the long run?
That's the counter-argument from those who support USAID. They say that investing in development and diplomacy is a smart way to prevent conflict, promote stability, and create new markets for U.S. goods and services. They point to examples like the Marshall Plan after World War II, where U.S. aid helped to rebuild Europe and create a lasting peace.
So it's not just about altruism. There's a strategic and economic rationale for helping other countries as well.
Absolutely. And you've highlighted research that shows a strong correlation between development aid and things like reduced poverty, improved health outcomes, and increased economic growth in recipient countries. Those benefits, in turn, can lead to greater stability, reduced migration pressures, and new opportunities for trade and investment, which ultimately benefit the U.S. as well.
It seems like there are a lot of different factors to consider here.
It's a very complex issue with far-reaching implications. And it's not just a theoretical debate. There are real people whose lives are at stake here. You've shared stories from individuals who have been directly impacted by USAID programs, like that woman in Kenya who received microfinance loans to start her own business, or that family in Bangladesh whose village was saved from flooding thanks to USAID-funded infrastructure projects.
That's what gets lost sometimes in all the political back and forth, right? The fact that there are real human consequences to these decisions.
Exactly. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract arguments about budgets and foreign policy, but we need to remember that USAID's work ultimately boils down to helping people.
Okay, so we've looked at the arguments for and against shutting down USAID. But from a purely practical standpoint, how would something like this actually work? Can Trump just shut down a government agency on his own say-so? You raised this question in your research.
You're right, that's a key point. And it gets into some pretty tricky constitutional territory. The power of the purse, meaning the authority to allocate funding, rests with Congress. So in theory, Trump can't simply shut down USAI without their approval.
But didn't he already impose a global freeze on foreign aid? You sent an article about that.
You're absolutely right. He did issue an executive order shortly after taking office, pausing all foreign aid for 90 days. That caused a lot of disruption within USAID and among the organizations that rely on their funding. But a temporary freeze is different from a permanent shutdown.
So what's the likely scenario here? Is Trump going to try to force this through without Congress?
It's hard to say for sure. There's been a lot of speculation about what his next move will be. Some think he might try to use his executive authority to circumvent Congress, which would almost certainly lead to legal challenges. Others believe he might try to negotiate a deal with Congress, perhaps by offering concessions on other issues in exchange for their approval to shut down USAID.
You've also sent over some articles about the possibility of USI being absorbed into the State Department. Is that a real possibility?
It's definitely something that's been floated by some in the administration. The idea is that merging USAID with the State Department would streamline foreign policy operations and eliminate redundancy.
But wouldn't that essentially gut USAID and its mission?
That's the concern many people have. They worry that USAID would lose its independence and its focus on development and humanitarian assistance if it were folded into the State Department, which has a broader and more explicitly political agenda. There's a fear that aid decisions would become politicized and that USAID's effectiveness would be compromised.
It seems like we're at a real crossroads here. This whole situation is so fluid, it's hard to predict what's going to happen next.
It really is. And the stakes are incredibly high, not just for the future of USAID, but for the millions of people who depend on its programs and for America's role in the world.
It feels like we're watching a real-time power struggle play out here, a clash between different visions for America's role in the world.
It certainly is. And you've highlighted how this goes beyond just budgets and aid. You've sent over sources that talk about this idea of a more transactional approach to foreign policy gaining traction.
I saw that phrase come up a lot in the articles you sent, but I'm not sure I fully grasp it. Can you break that down for me?
Well, think of it this way. A transactional approach means that relationships are based primarily on self-interest and immediate gains. It's about what you can get out of the deal right now, rather than building long-term partnerships based on shared values or mutual benefit.
So instead of thinking about the big picture, it's more like a quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Exactly. And for those who advocate for this approach, they argue that it's a more realistic way of dealing with the world as it is. A world where every country is ultimately looking out for its own interests.
But isn't that a pretty cynical view? And wouldn't that make it harder to build trust and cooperation with other countries?
Those are some of the criticisms leveled against this approach. You've highlighted sources that argue that a purely transactional approach can be short-sighted and ultimately counterproductive. They say that it can alienate allies, undermine America's moral authority, and create a more unstable and unpredictable world.
It seems like this whole situation with USAID is really forcing a debate about what America stands for in the world.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's about more than just aid dollars. It's about values, priorities, and America's place on the global stage.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but it's clear that this story is still unfolding. What are some of the key things we should be watching for in the coming days and weeks?
Well, first and foremost, keep an eye on what happens in Congress. Will they push back against Trump's attempt to shut down USAID? Will they try to negotiate a compromise? What conditions might they attach to any funding for the agency?
And what about the legal challenges? You mentioned that there could be some lawsuits if Trump tries to bypass Congress. What's the latest on that front?
Well, you've flagged several legal experts who argue that Trump would be on shaky ground if he tried to unilaterally shut down USAID. They point to the Constitution and the separation of powers, arguing that Congress has the ultimate authority over funding. It's likely that any move by Trump to circumvent Congress would be met with swift legal action.
So this could end up in the courts.
It's certainly a possibility, and if that happens, it could drag on for months, if not years, creating even more uncertainty and disruption.
And while all this is happening, what about the people who rely on USAID programs? What happens to them if the agency is shut down or its funding is cut off?
That's the most pressing concern, and unfortunately, it's the one that often gets lost in the political wrangling. You've shared some heartbreaking stories from people in developing countries who depend on USAID for food, water, healthcare, and other essential services. The impact of a shutdown on these vulnerable populations could be devastating.
It's a lot to process, and it feels like there are more questions than answers right now. but I think we've done a good job of laying out the key issues and highlighting the different perspectives on this incredibly complex situation.
I agree. And as we continue to follow this story, I think it's important to keep asking those big picture questions. What kind of role does America want to play in the world? What are our values? What are our priorities? The answers to those questions will ultimately shape the future of U.S. foreign policy, and they will have a profound impact on the lives of people around the globe.
Well said. Thanks for breaking all this down for us. And thanks to you, our listeners, for sending in your questions and sources. We always appreciate your engagement.
And we encourage you to stay informed and stay engaged. This is a story that's far from over, and your voices matter.
Until next time, this is the DRM News Podcast signing off.